October 10th, 1911, soldiers of the new army in Hubei, China, rose up and captured the provincial capital of Wuchang. They were soon joined by more members of the new army and others supportive of the revolutionary cause. The Xinhai Revolution had begun. In just 4 months, they had toppled the Qing Dynasty along with over 2,000 years of imperial tradition. In the aftermath, a leadership divided by ideological and personal differences increasingly used military force to resolve political disputes, giving rise to a fractured military apparatus that soon found it had little use for politicians, other than to give their own regimes a veneer of legitimacy. At the time that the nationalists declared the unification of the country in 1928, China was divided by warlords in many of the provinces, communist insurgents in the countryside, and was soon faced with repeated invasions by aggressive neighbors. The ensuing 8-year war with Japan would be absorbed into the wider Second World War and would leave China in ruins. And afterward, there was still the final showdown between nationalism and communism. This is China's Republican era. Well, it's mainland China's Republican era. As usual, it's more complicated than that. But basically, the years from 1911 to 1949 can be broadly thought of as China's experiment with Republican government. Not to spoil too much right from the get-go, but it was an abysmal failure. It provided the basis for China's current state. An overbearing central government with a politically indoctrinated military keeping it in place. In the English-speaking part of the world, the story of China's Republican experiment is one that has forever remained largely on the fringe of historical discussion. Little more than a blip in history, a mere transition period between the fall of the Qing Dynasty and the rise of the People's Republic of China, rather than an era of history in its own right. Despite its loss of life being second only to the Soviet Union, China's story in World War II has been pushed to the fringe, if not entirely forgotten, in English-language literature and pop culture. I mean, when was the last time you saw a movie or video game focused on the Chinese theater of the war? The decades of political and military strife between the Revolution and the war with Japan are even further out on the margins of history, both in the West and in China itself. This series seeks to help rectify that. I'm not a historian, but, in the words of a great history podcaster, I am a fan of history. I may never write a history book myself, but there are a number of English-language books out there that do cover this period. What's lacking is a comprehensive, all-inclusive guide that brings all those sources together and distills them into a form that can be conveyed to the casual fan of history in a meaningful and educational manner. To be sure, this is an ambitious project. I don't know of any author or documentarian who has done a comprehensive series on the full period of 1911 to 49. Even James E. Sheridan's definitive work, China in Disintegration, doesn't cover the whole period in all its details. But Chinese Republican history has become a pet hobby of mine, and I'd like to share what I've learned with all my fellow history fans who may be interested. So let's get started. Modern China is home to 56 officially recognized ethnicities who speak about 297 living languages, which can be categorized into 9 language families, at least 12 of which have writing systems that don't use Chinese characters. Not only that, but many of those languages and ethnicities are divided into a plethora of subgroups. Chinese alone, which the government in Beijing continues to insist is a single language divided into a number of dialects, has at least 6 to 9 major dialects, depending on how you count them. All of these are mutually unintelligible to each other, and all have their own set of dialects that range from mutually intelligible to semi-intelligible to mostly unintelligible. Tibetan, meanwhile, is less of a language and more of a dialect continuum, with around 25 major dialect groups. Then there are regional languages, such as Zhuang, which is more closely related to Thai than it is to the Chinese family, and minor ones, like the Miao Yao languages, which used to be considered a group of Chinese dialects, but are now generally agreed to be a family of their own. Getting an idea of the enormity of China? China is a huge country, and even though the vast majority of the population identify as part of the Han ethnicity, all Han are not the same. There is a wide disparity in the culture of people in Zhejiang and in Guangdong, and between those in Hunan and Qinghai, and even between Mandarin speakers of provinces like Sichuan and Shandong. Modern-day China can be divided into 5 major regions along geographic, historical, and cultural lines. In the west, you have the Tibetan Plateau. Northwest is Xinjiang. In the north is Inner Mongolia. To the northeast is Manchuria. And in the middle and along the south and east coasts is China proper. China proper is the home of the Han people. The Han, or Khan, as would be closer to how it's actually pronounced, are named for the ancient Han Dynasty. They're the people that made China, China. When people think Chinese, they're usually thinking Han. Conveniently, China proper can be divided into 3 subregions based on the 3 major rivers that dominate its geography, and a major city that dominates each subregion. North China is based around the Yellow River, dominated by the city of Beijing, and sometimes includes Manchuria. Now you might point out that Beijing isn't on the Yellow River, to which I would simply reply, no, but the river it is on used to be a tributary of the Yellow River. Yes, I know the Yellow River mouth is nearly 300 kilometers from Beijing, but it likes to wander around the map like a Mongolian nomad. Central China is formed around the Yangtze River and is dominated by Shanghai. Finally, South China is around the Pearl River, where you'll find Hong Kong. There are other unofficial regional divisions that can be used as well, like the Northwest, and sometimes the Yangtze is considered to be merely the border between the North and South, rather than a region in and of itself. I've even seen the entire Yangtze region counted as part of North China, along with Manchuria. Like all such unofficial designations, the lines between these regions are blurry, and every second person you ask seems to have a different opinion on their dimensions. So I'll try to stick with the above definitions. If I use another term later in the series, I'll introduce it then. Han civilization grew up along the banks of the Yellow River, from where they spread out to dominate the whole of China proper, eventually absorbing most of the other peoples who used to live there. 3 of the most notable minorities in the region would be the Miao, Yao, and Zhuang, living in the south-central and southwest areas respectively. Mandarin is mostly spoken in the north and in the interior, while the east coast and the south are divided between various other languages: Wu, Min, Gan, Hakka, Xiang, Cantonese, and the aforementioned Miao Yao and Zhuang languages. The south has very hilly, sometimes mountainous terrain in many places, with some areas dominated by dense subtropical rainforests. Being closer to the equator means it's much warmer than the north, and the people have darker, sometimes slightly yellow-tinged skin, which may or may not have had anything to do with the old moniker, the Yellow Race. The landscape is littered with architectural monuments to the past. Found in every corner of the land are palaces, temples, and mausoleums hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. Cities such as Beijing, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Changsha, Changde, Wuhan, and Xi'an played critical roles at various points throughout the long history of China, and each have a part to play in the Republican era as well. Sites such as the now destroyed Old Summer Palace combined various architectural styles, from Tibet, China, and even Europe, into a single complex. Historically, China was always the cultural, economic, technological, and political center of East Asia. Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese all based their writing scripts off Chinese script. Japan still uses Chinese characters today in the form of kanji, one of the 3 scripts that make up their convoluted writing system. Up until relatively recently, China was on par with Europe, technologically and culturally, if not Europe's superior. Qing Dynasty China is the only settled civilization to have ever conquered and ruled over a large swath of steppe nomads before the invention of firearms. During the Mongol invasions of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, it was the expertise of the Chinese siege engineers they employed which allowed them to capture so many cities with ease. Feudalism never truly developed in China as it did in Europe. There was a feudalism of sorts in the distant past, but Qin Shi Huang sounded its death knell when he instituted the reforms that became the basis of imperial rule in the 200s BC. The system he put in place changed and adapted considerably over the years as each dynasty found it necessary to modify it to serve their own needs and whims. A study of the ins and outs of how the bureaucracy changed over time is way beyond the scope of this series, but it will be helpful to take a look at how it worked in the late Qing Dynasty. When the Qing captured Beijing in 1644 and laid claim to the Mandate of Heaven, it inherited an extensive and deeply entrenched civil service. China's civil service was a complex and efficient system for its time. It was what had allowed emperors in Beijing, or wherever the capital happened to be, to maintain control over the far-flung provinces of the empire. Confucian principles of government and morality were the cornerstone of the whole system. Rather than selecting officials based on birth, there was a regularly held imperial examination, wherein applicants were tested on their knowledge of the Confucian classics. While writing the essay for the test, applicants were put in separate stalls to prevent cheating, where they would stay for several days until the allotted time was up. That's where they ate, slept, and went to the bathroom. The examination was highly competitive, and very few passed. Creativity was only acceptable within the narrow confines of established orthodoxy. Memory was the key to passing, since the goal was to ensure civil service officials were well versed in the classics. Confucius taught that men of impeccable moral character make good government, and the Chinese believed that only men dedicated to Confucian principles could truly be moral. Passing the first level of the examination qualified a scholar to serve in the first of three tiers of government: local, provincial, and national. Each higher level required the scholar to take another, harder test. Having passed, a scholar sometimes had to wait for some time before an opening appeared, allowing them to actually take up an office. Under the Qing, officials were regularly rotated in and out of positions every 3 or 4 years, and were barred from serving in their own locality, ostensibly to prevent them from building up local networks of corruption, but corruption was endemic by the late Qing period despite these measures. In theory, the system was based entirely on merit. Anyone who met the educational requirements could take the examination, with a few exceptions, such as actors and merchants' sons, people considered of too low a moral quality to qualify. In reality, the educational requirements meant that only the wealthy could afford to consider taking the exam. Tutors and textbooks were even more expensive then than now. Bribery and personal connections helped a lot too. Still, there was more chance for upward mobility than in outright caste systems like in India or under European feudalism. For a peasant to achieve even the lowest tier of the civil service was extremely rare, but it did happen. Extended family would pool their money to send one of their sons to take the exam. Failed applicants would try again, and again, and again. Failing so many times could be disheartening. Some would go on trying until they died of old age. Some would go on trying until they suffered a nervous breakdown, convinced themselves they were the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and went on to lead a massive revolution that saw tens of millions dead. No, seriously, that actually happened once. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The reason a career in the civil service was so desirable was because it was really the only good way of getting ahead in life. Merchants could get rich if they played their cards right, but they were seen as filthy money grabbers by good society. Owning land could get a man money and status, but wasn't the fastest way of climbing the ladder. Land was traditionally owned by families over many generations, making it hard to amass more. And modern banking didn't exist, which made capital for purchasing land hard to get. Both of these options also required either inheriting or acquiring large amounts of startup capital and held inherent risks that could spell the end of the venture in one fell swoop. The civil service was where it was at. As proper Confucian gentlemen, they were well respected by those around them, and there was the possibility of advancement if you worked hard, not to mention plenty of opportunities to make money through bribery and embezzlement. To have a relative in the civil service also immediately boosted the status of the official's entire family in their own community. In short, it was the most prestigious, most reliable way of personal enrichment, providing for family, and making a name for oneself. And, critically, it was open to everyone. Well, to men who didn't fall into a few specific categories, as I already mentioned. Women were barred from serving, but it was open to far more people than European or Indian top-level positions were. Even the lowliest peasant could one day become prime minister of the entire empire if he acquired the requisite education and worked very, very hard. This meant that competent and intelligent men from all corners of the empire put their energies into passing examinations, with the result being that in China, the best and brightest were the ones turning the gears of state, rather than relying on the birth lottery to produce competence through innate breeding. All this ensured a measure of stability, but it wasn't the perfect method. On the one hand, examinations provided an outlet for men who might otherwise devote their energies to rebellion. On the other hand, standards for passing were so frustratingly high that some men became so enraged they reacted violently. The system did seem rigged against you. By the mid-19th century, only 1 to 1.5% of applicants passed each level, numbers which had been steadily declining since the population boom of the 18th century. If you happened to be any ethnicity other than Manchu, the system really was rigged against you. Each dynasty had different ways of ruling. In the Qing, relatives of the emperor were given top priority for high-level jobs in the military and bureaucracy. Manchus, those of the same ethnicity as the Qing emperors, had affirmative action working in their favor. Manchus didn't have to take the same examination as everyone else did, and so were heavily overrepresented in the civil service. Manchus made up about 1/400th of the population. You do the math, and you'll know how frustrating it could be for everyone else. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Qing Dynasty had every reason to believe it was on top of the world. No other Chinese empire had ever attained the size or population of the Qing. From humble beginnings, as semi-nomadic farmers and herders, they had not only conquered the once mighty Ming Empire, but had carved out an empire twice the size and population of their forebear. Neighbors such as Korea, Vietnam, and the Ryukyu Islands came to Beijing every year to pay tribute to the Emperor of the Great Qing. Not that there weren't problems. The Qing dynasty included a wide variety of ethnic and cultural groups, not all of whom benefited from Qing rule. As such, there was a constant string of minor local conflicts, from ethno-religious wars in Xinjiang to tribal conflicts over grazing land in Tibetan Mongolia. In some cases, these wars were cause for concern, such as the Jihad in Xinjiang, the White Lotus Rebellion, and a series of failed military ventures in Burma and Vietnam. This, however, was business as usual in an empire the size of the Qing dynasty. Another matter the Qing court had to deal with was that of trade and diplomatic communication with the West. Besides sporadic and limited cases, long-term direct contact was made in the 16th century by Portuguese merchants who established a base of operations in Macau on the southern coast. just across the bay from Hong Kong, though Hong Kong wasn't there yet. The Chinese were confident in the belief that the Confucian way of doing things they had developed over 2 millennia was the best governmental system, the best moral code in the world. By extension, everyone else in the world was morally inferior, and so had nothing to offer China. Increasingly over the centuries, Chinese rulers found it necessary to make the ceremonies of state more and more elaborate to inspire awe in foreigners and fear in potential rivals and rebels. In fact, by the time of the Qing, the emperors claimed to be the rightful rulers of the whole world. They didn't even have a governmental ministry for dealing with foreign countries. Instead, they had a department for dealing with vassal states. The Chinese name for China, Zhenghua, which is usually translated Middle Kingdom, conveys the sense that China is in the center of the universe. Under this worldview, the West was generally viewed with either patronizing curiosity or contempt. Europeans were barbarians, clearly beneath the dignity of Confucian gentlemen. For their part, the Europeans viewed the Chinese as pompous and self-righteous, with hugely inflated egos. Even so, there were those on both sides who realized they could benefit from each other. Money's a huge motivator. In the 16th century, missionaries attempted to proselytize China under the Qing Dynasty at the time, and even visited the Imperial court many times, where they shared European knowledge of mathematics and astronomy with Chinese scholars. Occasional Western curiosities, such as pocket watches, also made their way into elite circles during this time, where educated Chinese saw their value. Ultimately, however, the Qing emperors feared that whatever valuable ideas or trade goods the Westerners might have would also come with dangerous ideas that could infect the people and give rise to rebellion, or worse, they might corrupt Chinese morals. Popular rebellion was the mortal fear of the Qing rulers, and corrupt morals were of course anathema to upright Confucians. The Westerners were restricted to trading only in the far southern port of Guangzhou, near Macau. Closing themselves off from innovation forestalled the inevitable reality check. By devoting themselves to traditions which had worked in the past, the Qing failed to recognize the world changing around them. They failed to see that Europe had far surpassed them, technologically, socially, administratively, and in practically every other arena in which civilizations can be compared to each other. For starters, there was the army, the first part of which was the banner armies. The Eight Banners was a highly complex socio-military organization that I don't want to get into just yet. There'll be enough time to talk about it when we get into the events of the 1850s and 60s. And yes, that's was, not were. Eight banners, though plural in English, is treated grammatically as singular due to some interlinguistic shenanigans going on in translation. Suffice it to say that the Eight Banners included Manchus, Mongols, and Han, along with some Koreans and even, at one point, a few Russians, and had its origin in the twilight years of the 16th century. Bannermen served as the dynasty's core support base, and therefore as the core of its army. It was, in essence, a contract made by virtue of birth. Bannermen pledged absolute loyalty to the emperor, and in return, the emperors ensured they were looked after. They formed the banner armies, which was considered the cream of the crop of the Qing army and served both on the front lines of war and in garrisons scattered throughout China. In return, they received a monthly stipend of silver and grain from the government, in addition to their regular salary. The other component of the army, and by far the larger one, was the Green Standard Army. While the banner armies were the backbone of the Qing military machine, the Green Standard Army was the meat and potatoes. Open to all ethnicities, the Green Standard Army was a way for poor peasant boys unable to afford an education to escape a life tied to the plough. Because of this, the Green Standard became known for being made up of the dregs of society, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as military discipline was kept tight. In the latter half of the 1700s, however, steadily growing financial difficulties meant military budget cuts that contributed to an increasing laxity in discipline. Equipment wasn't properly maintained. New innovations, such as muskets, were not adopted en masse as they were in Europe. A lack of funds meant a shortage of ammunition, which meant live-fire drills were rare. The banner armies, which had once conquered the mighty Ming Empire, had undergone generations of living on welfare, while simultaneously seeing themselves as better than those around them. Coupled with the lack of major wars to encourage a state of readiness, bannermen's discipline and skill eventually diminished to the point of becoming an object of derision by others. Meanwhile, inflation drove prices up toward the end of the 18th century, but bannermen's stipends stayed at the same level, leaving many in poverty. It was illegal for a bannerman to make a living outside of either the banner armies or the civil service, but there weren't enough positions available for everyone, even after mass numbers of Han bannermen were cut out of the banners in the mid-18th century to alleviate budget concerns. Wages in the Green Standard Army were even worse, so soldiers took to appropriation and looting to get by. The Qing economy, already on the decline in the second half of the 18th century, took a massive hit at the end of the century. Despite the Qing's efforts to secure itself against Western influence by reducing trade with Western powers, China was already heavily reliant on imports of one item above all others: silver. Silver was the lifeblood of the Chinese economy. The dynasty's currency was in silver coins. Taxes were paid in silver. Salaries for soldiers and officials were paid in silver. Bannerman stipends were paid partially in silver. Construction projects and public works, such as maintenance of the Yellow River dikes, which was critical for the prevention of apocalyptic flooding in the region, was paid for in silver. At the time, most of the world's silver was mined in Mexico. Most of the rest came from Peru. The French Revolutionary Wars and the Latin American Wars of Independence resulted in a catastrophic plummet in the global silver supply. China, blissfully unaware of events beyond its borders despite pretensions of universal monarchy, had a hard time coming to a conclusion as to the sudden difficulties they now faced. But we're going to have to leave it there. Join me next time as the debate over opium heats up.